and welcome to Together We're Better. Oh boy, we're excited today because in the studio we have Teddy Abrams. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Scott, for having me.
It's just terrific to have you here. And just so that folks know, you, like we mentioned earlier, we could spend the entire interview just going over your bio because what you've already accomplished here by 33 years old is amazing. You're already a widely acclaimed music director of the Louisville Orchestra. You're the music director and conductor of the Britt Orchestra. You're an established pianist, clarinetist, and composer. And with all of those things, what we're really going to focus on today is that you're a tireless advocate for the power of music. And one of the reasons we have our show going and why I'm so excited to talk to you is because, we talk about that the arts are absolutely essential and we have to find ways to keep them in our communities and schools. And we also know that the news is generally bleak, but that the world is filled with inspired people like you who are making really positive impacts through the power of the arts and just connecting with your community. And then speaking of connection, we were already a world kind of narrowing with our social media platforms, but of course, because of COVID and shelter in place, we're isolated. And so more than ever, we just need to find new ways to connect. So thank you so much for sharing your ideas and your voice on this and sitting down and you're thinking about a season and you're thinking about how you're going to connect with audiences or what it means to connect with your city. Why do our communities need music and why do they need to gather?
Well, yeah, they do need to gather, and that's why we're seeing people doing it maybe against their better judgment, right, or against other people's better judgment, perhaps. I think partly because there is this social element to everything that we do that's so essentially human. Like you can't take out the very nature of what it means to be a human being, and we're social beings. I mean, there, aside from the occasional hermit and the extreme introverts, but even in those cases, I mean, we're meant to have that kind of diverse social interaction, not just with our immediate families. And we're also incredibly hardy in that you think about the people that spread out across the country for better or for worse, hundreds of years ago. And I mean, you just imagine the circumstances when they were homesteading or, building a farm out of absolute nothing, and probably would be just their family. They were social distancing like that in the, mid 1800s in much of the country. And you think about the connection that those folks must have had to each other and to nature when there was no alternative, that was tempting them. So we know we can do it, but our kind of natural instinct is to share experiences, and it's to make things that give us a sense that there's maybe a bigger picture that we can't access by ourselves. I mean, I think that's the whole point of art, that if we could do it all ourselves, then we would. Everybody would just be at home with their own paintings and just a piano in a room with four walls. And musicians would be satisfied to simply practice the Bach cello suites or something like that, or compose their own music or hear it in their head. That would be enough. It would be enough to just watch Netflix, and never, experience a live theater or a live rock show or something like that. But we need to access this together because there's some information in it that speaks to the things about, life that you can never fully understand. You can never fully comprehend. It's just too big. It's too vibrant. You can only experience it like that. And sharing it with other human beings, it's a shared kind of energy that nothing else can replicate. I mean, it's why people, see something, when they see something beautiful and they want to share it with other people, they want to tell people, they take a picture of it. There's, if you think about it objectively, why do they need to do that? Shouldn't it, just if you think about it very squarely, if somebody sees an incredible sunset or a life-changing film, wouldn't that just be enough for them to just see it and know that it was great and file that away under the great things they've experienced? But no, a lot of time our first instinct is tell somebody, I wish that person was here. Or, oh man, you would have loved this. That's our instinct. And I think that speaks to why the power of the musical art form and all art forms has endured. It's an eternal part of the species, because as soon as we realized it had this deeper power to, we say connect us, but it's even beyond just simply feeling like we're in the same space connected together. It's beyond that. It's that somehow we're accessing the part of humanity that it's too vibrant, it's too bright to really see face on. I was watching the interview with Trevor Noah and Jim Carrey. You know, yeah, Jim Carrey wrote this autobiography that's like half fiction. It's apparently a total trip. It's very weird. But this interview was so crazy. If anybody has a chance to see it, because it's pretty. I mean, it's very Jim Carrey. It's very out there, but it's super next level. Like, he's kind of a little bit enlightened. He's pretty weird too, but he's also a little bit enlightened. He was talking about how, as human beings, like, our bodies and our sense of ourselves could never contain who we really are. Who we really are is just so big, and there's so much there that it's constantly overflowing. And I think a little bit of art is like that too, that it's the art itself is overflowing beyond its confines. It's not just a string quartet or a piano solo or one rock band. It's like it's overflowing to try and reach us all. So that's why these things are important, and you know, good for all of us for trying to figure out how to make it work in this era, where we're trying to move as fast as the world is moving. And that's really, really hard to do. So good for all. Like, we have to take a step back and pat ourselves on the back a little bit, because artists have adapted so quickly, and they've tried things, and a lot of times they've done it very generously. They haven't asked for anything in return. Maybe to their, you know, their own chagrin, because they're, you know, especially musical artists are not always the most financially minded, but we've been so out there trying to share our music, you know, get it to people to help as we all deal with this together. So I think we should just take a step back, as bad as things are, and look at the combined efforts of musicians around the world the last few months has been, I have to say, outstanding. I think that's a real showing of strength.
If there is a silver lining, and there are many, and we want to acknowledge that this has been a very hard time for many people. So when we talk about silver linings, it can be even painful to even consider, because there is a level of grief that's been profound for large swaths of the entire world. But when we do discuss like what we might gain from this, is that concept that we're not far away from each other, and we're not different enough from each other that we can't find ways to connect and support and inspire each other. And that's something I think that maybe you're mentioning, is just as you see all these artists coming from all quadrants in the world, trying to find a way to connect and to express, there's been an unbelievable explosion of virtual productions, which didn't or weren't happening pre-COVID, because the need of the human spirit had a free reign of expression. And then as we got confined, we found this bandwidth of available space to recreate the semblance of connection and creation. And that has been really, really wonderful to see. And I was wondering, you mentioned, you know, the idea that there's too much, it cannot be contained in one body. And I was having this discussion about Mahler, and, you know, for the casual listener, you know, maybe they're just used to listening to, you know, they throw in their Nirvana album, they love it, and it reminds them of when they're 15, you know, which describes me, that if you say, hey, your first classical concert is going to be Mahler, and you say, and they're like, oh, that sounds nice, how long is the piece? And you say, an hour and 40 minutes. They're like, whoa, that's a commitment. But I think something like Mahler is actually very approachable, because it is all of what you just said, which is that it is too much to be contained in a 3-minute concept. It has to unfold over this incredible journey. And by the time you're finished with it, you've really experienced something beyond yourself.
Yeah. Well, that's been our ongoing challenge for some time, that as attention spans have changed, I won't just say they've decreased, but I think we've all recognized that our attention requirements and what other people expect from us is very different, obviously. And it's been a gradient change for the last couple of decades, an extreme one. And of course, you look at how various other parts of the entertainment world have reacted to that. And you see rock concerts that are, you know, like at this point, Cirque du Soleil. You know, you see even Paul McCartney had, when I saw him last live, I mean, there were flames coming out of the stage and stuff like that. And most people would probably be content to just watch Paul McCartney strum a guitar and sing. But even he had, you know, it was a full pyrotechnics show. And same thing with cinema. Cinema has just become extravaganza. And you know, I mean, I think there's a real correlation between, okay, movies like, you know, Marvel, the giant, you know, Avengers movies are epics. They're very long, but they're packed with such incredible imagery and production value and stimulation that it makes up for the decreases in the general ability to pay attention. And I always remind people, it's not because humans are getting stupid or it's not our fault, but when people send you a text message, they expect a response either that second or at least that hour. And after that, you're just ignoring them, even if you get back to them. And that's a new thing, you know. I mean, people could not be found until probably the 80s, you know, to some extent, that you know, you'd be chasing people. If they were out, they were truly out. And that demand on our attention does not correlate with the expectations for the music that we play. That music was meant to unfold. It's not just unfolding at its own pace. It's the pace of human beings that lived in a different era, when compared to any other way that there might be demands on somebody's attention, the Mahler Symphony was by far the most engaging. It was the equivalent of the Marvel Cinematic Universe in its era. Going to see the spectacle in the late 19th century, early 20th century of 120 musicians with a 300-person chorus on a stage, singing in this incredibly operatic, very storytelling kind of style, watching 8 horns and offstage banda. That must have been, compared to what everyday life was, which was generally a very different pace. Even if it had its own internal excitement, it had none of the constant visual stimulation that we have. That was the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I know that point sounds obvious, but it's been the challenge that nobody is fully confronted in terms of how we approach art. It's temporal. It's not like a painting where the time it takes to look at a painting painted yesterday is the same amount of time it takes to look at a painting painted 400 years ago. You can pass right by it, or you can spend an hour looking at it. It's your choice. But music is meant to unfold across time. And the sense of time during Bach's era is not our sense of time right now. And there's a reason that, an 8-minute rock song is considered a massive epic work. I mean, it's considered just, unlike, a Led Zeppelin or a Who song that takes 8 minutes is considered just, unbelievably long. Like, that's just, and the length of it's usually only extended by a repeating cell of chords. It's not like it's a continuous stream of new music being generated. It's like, in one of those songs, there'll be some section that's just looped in a jam band kind of orientation. So even that's playing on the fact that our attention doesn't support that. So I guess it's all to say that we've been dealing with this for some time now, and there are different solutions. I think one of the big solutions that people have come up with, the spectacle and the beauty of how it's presented, has a big impact on how people experience it. And the idea that one could go to the Hollywood Bowl and watch Yo-Yo Ma sitting by himself on one of the most important magical stages in the world, and then watch 2.5 hours of pure music plus intermissions to see the complete Bach cello suites. Yes, you would say, how does that work given what I just said about attention spans? Well, there's magic in seeing a human being that we all care about. We all care about Yo-Yo. We all know that he's one of the great musicians and one of the great people in our world. And that music, of course, is beautiful, but the attention is dealt with by the magic of being there, knowing that it's a once in a lifetime experience. Like, there are ways of dealing with it. It's not just purely, was it a good performance or not? The same thing with a lot of what, the LA Phil has done, or the New York Phil has done. San Francisco Symphony has certainly done it with creating performances that have, really smart collaborative elements. So I know that, LA Phil did a spectacular staging of Das Lied, for instance, that Yuval Sharon directed. And you don't need to stage that piece. You don't need to, whatever that means. But the idea that you would say, in this era, we have access to incredible directors and incredible lighting technology and incredible staging technology, especially in a city like that. Let's experiment with it. And for an audience to sit there for the very first time and hear Das Lied, there is a chance that somebody who's never heard it, doesn't know anything about that music, could have a life-changing experience. But maybe we should give ourselves more of a chance by setting it up to deliberately engage people, not asking them to bring more to the table than they might be capable of. And I think we have to meet people where they are. We have to remember that people are running, again, the experience of going to see one of those massive performances in the 19th century there was a big buildup to it. Now people are, screeching in the cars, trying to park, run in, use the restroom. It's last minute in their lives. A lot of times they don't necessarily want to be there. They might be dragged there by somebody else. So remember, that these are real factors. You can't ignore that. And just because we love Mahler, we shouldn't assume that everybody loves Mahler or even cares about Mahler. So my whole point is, let's set ourselves up for success. Usually in our world, what we do is we say, well, this music is so great, it should be self-evident. This should be self-evident. But that's ridiculous. It shouldn't be self-evident because our world doesn't make it self-evident. Those folks that are running in there and exhausted, and they've come from a 10-hour workday, and somebody invited them to the show and they're tired. Don't assume it's going to be self-evident for them. Set yourself up for every possible success to get them on board. They can be reached. But if you don't think about their experience, you're a bad salesman, is what I would say. You know what I mean? Like you're asking for a lot from the customer.
Well, I've noticed that because I have a community orchestra here on the West Coast, and it's designed to engage younger listeners because I'm in the public schools. Many of the musicians teach in the public schools, so our average listener attendee is going to be between like 10 years old and 15 years old, which means their parents come, and their parents may not also have been folks that have subscription series to SF or something like that. So we're getting a new audience and a younger audience in general, and so we do a lot of elements of lighting to just kind of keep it visually engaging. Although I've got to say, for the 10 to 13-year-old crowd, seeing, like you mentioned, 120 musicians together is pretty powerful. And also, I don't care how your speaker system is set up, it is not the same sound as sitting 4 rows away from a live orchestra. So there's this level of engagement that just is sort of inherent with having these large ensembles working together. And one of the things that we try to really make sure to do is to have these little concert talks throughout. So it becomes less formal. So it's not just me on stage and the musicians on stage and the rest of you in the audience, just here's our gift, accept it. But it becomes a sort of conversational piece where, like we just did the Rite of Spring in February, and we talked about what it would be like to experience this entire story and journey of Stravinsky. And here's the bassoon, and this is, one little leaf expanding through this cold, a lot of imagery to help engage them so they can feel connected in a way that makes sense to them. Because you can't talk about any of the structure when they're coming in with limited, just sort of fundamental, musicianship, right? We have to connect with them on where they're ready to connect with. And that's been successful in its own little way. But it's always trying to find other ways to help people feel like this was an experience that was profound and memorable, and I can't wait to share it with others. Yeah. And so I know that you were already doing, tons of great work with Louisville Orchestra before COVID, right? Like you had all this stuff planned, because I'm sure, my life is I think about 2023 when I'm in 2020, right? You're getting your soloists, you're getting all these different things, you're planning. And then COVID happened and plans changed pretty abruptly. So what is the direction of the orchestra now? Like, what are you doing to adapt to keep the musicians engaged and excited about of what they're able to give, and for all the folks that were listening, and then just the impact on the city?
Normally, an orchestra or a performing arts institution, they try and basically say, here's what we want to do. Now, how can we get everyone to buy it? And how do we get them to spend their money on what we want? And that's fine. That's what everyone does in the entertainment industry, generally. What we decided to do this year is take a step back and reverse engineer the whole process, because Louisville, obviously, like everyone, has the same COVID issues. What we decided to do was look at the city honestly and say, where are the areas of critical need? This is a moment of critical need, so what are the areas that have critical need? The obvious one being the healthcare industry and the healthcare world, because there's a health crisis. The education world, because we know the ridiculous amount of stress that is placed on teachers, on parents, on the kids themselves. And historically, there is such remarkable inequality in education in this country, especially music education. And we thought, okay, let's identify that. It connects to systemic racism and also systemic inequality. from an economic perspective. And in Kentucky, those things are very connected together. In Kentucky, you may remember that in the Senate race primary on the Democratic side, there was a man named Charles Booker, and his campaign was built around the idea of from the hood to the holler. That was his thing. He's a black man who was trying to connect the hood in Louisville to the hollers out in eastern Kentucky, for instance, that there's shared economic stories, that the economic inequalities actually cross all kinds of cultural barriers. But anyway, more on that. And then number three, there's a financial crisis. So the financial crisis may not be in the stock market to the same extent that it is in everyday people's fears and in their lost jobs and lost income. So let's identify three things: health, education, and the financial crisis articulated as what I'm calling access. Because if people don't have money, they don't have mobility, then they're not going to access your thing if all you're trying to do is sell it to you. So I'm calling it radical inclusivity. So those are our three values this season. And everything we do has to fit with those three. If it doesn't fit with one of those things, we're not doing it. We're not extracting the last couple dollars from people that can't afford it. We're not doing education that affects a tiny population. So what we've done is we formed this innovation committee to say, okay, based on those values, what are the ideas that we can do with our time, our talent, and our capabilities that match those needs? So we're not selling people something. We're actually saying, what can we do to serve? It's the Kennedy approach where, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. It's that approach. This is not the year to try and take people's resources and make them work. This is the year to use our music to heal, to grow, to educate, to build the city that we want to have. And it's resulted in some really fabulous thinking, because if you start with that question, you don't need all the traditional baggage. I don't need any more of the same thing when I felt in my heart that things needed to change. Now, I don't want a pandemic to force things to change, to actually step up and say, well, we talk about service. Every time these executive directors and artistic directors and people like that talk about what they're doing that's cool, it's all community engagement stuff, it's education stuff. They never get up to, maybe it's a recording here or there, but the vast majority of what they're describing when they talk about their cool things are all related to public service and engagement stuff. But yet when it comes to the finances, 90-something% of all their budgets just go to the same stuff year after year after year. I said, that's not living by our values. So that's why we got to step up and serve the community. We're a public institution. The institution has to step up. It's not just a collection of performers. This is an institution with value to the city. You take the city's name in your title, Louisville Orchestra, then what are you doing for the city? Anyway, that's my big soapbox.
Well, but it's fantastic. And there's a couple of things that you mentioned that I find very helpful, which is you said we are an institution. And I know that teaching in the elementary and middle schools, we're always looking at what's happening out in the world as a reflection of what we can do, right? So if you're demonstrating that you, as a Louisville Orchestra, this wonderful institution, is able to pivot and change your focus on truly serving the community, well, that inspires many others to do the same thing, because now they have a template and a model and also a vision, which is sometimes what's really hard to do. Listening to you speak, it gets me excited about going back to my students and saying, well, let's find ways that we can really be serving each other, because I know some of the things that we have are a little bit challenging, but we also have an awful lot that we can offer and we can give. So I think that you're representing that as the conductor and as the music director and as someone that has a very strong voice in all of this. That's going to only inspire others. And I hope that, of course, it inspires others to do the same thing, because I agree, we are fundamentally here really to serve. When I go into the public schools, one of the reasons that I chose to teach that level and in that organization is because if it hadn't been for the teachers in my life to help guide and give me a pathway, I wouldn't be here the way I am. Like, there was an incredible amount of giving from the people in my life to allow me to have what I have now. And I jokingly, one of my major teachers, Dr. Wharton from the University of Idaho, he gave me free lessons in high school. He did all this sort of stuff because he knew I couldn't afford it. And a couple of summers ago, I met up with him and I took him to dinner, and I bought him dinner, right? And I said, all right, Doc, all even, just being funny, because of course you can't repay that sort of gift. This is a man who believed in me and gave me a pathway. And the only way I can say thank you is to try and do that for others and to continually serve and help others. And this is the only way that we can do it. Here is a prime example of the positive force that can come out of challenging situations. So, I mean, just hearing you speak about it, it just makes me excited and it makes me ready. Like once we're finished here, I'm going to go, run to some project where I can reach out and say, hey, I just spoke with Teddy Abrams. Here are some ideas. Let's do this. Let's serve our community. So orchestra, like we've already touched on this a little bit, but I do want to just think about what, since you conduct an orchestra, the vehicle of the orchestra is interesting, right? It's definitely for quite some time now, it's been a very official concept of we go to the concert hall, we listen to a few symphonies, and then we go home. And that's sort of, in a very basic nutshell of the experience of going to an orchestra. So it's 2020. Our society, like you mentioned, is not living in the time of Bach. We're different, and we have a lot of other things that are going on and different things that are interesting to us. So the role of the orchestra, like how are we adapting? Are we gonna keep giving Mahler? Are we gonna keep giving it in the concert hall? Of course, right now it's closed due to shelter in place. But when we all come back, is that the model to use, or is it just a model to use?
This is the era to use the time that we have, and I was hoping I'd have more of that open mental space. But because of the challenges of rebuilding this season I just kind of described in its at least broad strokes, I haven't had it to the same extent. But there is more time to think, even for somebody who's kind of in emergency mode all the time. There is more time to think in certain ways because of just the way that life has changed. And this is the time to think about realistically and practically, but also unrealistically, and off in the clouds altogether, what it is we really want to do as artists. And I say that really as artists, not as musicians, as artists, as people who have a role in society. Just zoom out to 50,000 feet or whatever it is, and let your mind wander, saying, like, try and get back to that almost childlike self when you first wanted to be a musician. What was it about the act of making music that made you, there was that moment, we all had that moment when we said, I can do this, or I want to do this. There was something there. And it wasn't so I can be principal oboe of X orchestra. Nobody had that. I don't think, yes, maybe at some point you started to want that thing, but that wasn't the thing that inspired you. No, nobody thinks like that when you're a little kid. It's just, you know what I mean? When you're a little kid and you have that moment, it's like when somebody feels like they want to be an astronaut as a little kid, it's not just so that they can, wear the suit or get the badge or get the medal at the end. There's something about that there's something, maybe it's that they needed to see the earth from space. So there's that galvanizing moment. And that's what we should be reconnecting with, because that is the doorway to why we're really artists, to why we're really here in this role. We all have that purpose in society. And once you start going through that door, you're going to realize that the answer is not to get back to playing the same shows we did before as quickly as possible. That's not the answer. The answer is to look at this honestly and creatively, and to you can't know how to present your music that you're passionate about until you look at the world honestly. You can't. And okay, from my perspective, I'm so tired of trying to force America in 2020 to swallow Europe in 1850s designs. And this is not to say that playing the cello or the clarinet or the piano at the highest level has anything to do with this, not the actual act of making music. It's all the stuff around it, of where we make music, how we make music. All that centered around this very specific idea that doesn't resemble life in this country, in this moment, and all of our needs. And it's a little bit like an architect. If all the architects said, you know what, the ideal buildings are just the neoclassical buildings that were built in the 1820s in Vienna and in London, and then just stopped. Most architects get why those buildings are great, but then they look at the world as it and say, what, if I'm commissioned to make that building, what does San Francisco need from me? In that street corner right there, do they need a copy of a neoclassical Greek style temple? Or do they need something different? Maybe it's inspired by that. Maybe it's something totally different, but I learned it. I learned what that was. I incorporated that. But most of us still think that that was the best. Everything that came after that, just in the context of that being the best. Now, I'm not telling people what to think. I'm saying that I've gone through that childlike thing. I remember what made me want to be a musician. It was seeing MTT conduct an all Gershwin concert at Stern Grove when I was 9 years old. I remember that. It wasn't a traditional concert at all. It was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. Still, in my mind, that was the coolest thing I'd ever seen, being out there at Stern Grove, all bundled up in the freezing cold summer and watching them play this. Never heard of Gershwin before. I didn't grow up in a musical family. Nobody told me what Gershwin was. I didn't know. I never heard that music. I thought that was the most incredible music. It was like, I knew Mozart and Beethoven because I've been playing it as a pianist, not a very good one even by that point, but I heard this Gershwin. I thought, that's my music. I love this. Who is this? What is this? This is the coolest thing. And seeing the 10,000 people, maybe it was 15,000, I don't know how many people, they were up in the trees, Stern Grove in the summer. We got there, an hour and a half early. Even we were way up in the hill, like underneath some bush or something like that. We put a blanket down with dirt all over us. We weren't in the main area. Seeing all those people thrilled to be there. That's my defining experience. Not the temple-like thing. By temple is that outside concert that was for everybody I didn't know that wasn't the normal concert experience. I'd never even been to one before. And I'm not saying that everybody's ideal concert there, and not everybody's childlike moment will be that. But if you don't take that cold, hard look at why we all wanted to be musicians and artists, then we're just recreators. We're not creators. And I've tried to go back into that place so many times because I know that's the inspiration that's going to keep me going. It's not going to be the external things, the titles and the this and the that, and you guest conducted here and there. Who cares? Nobody, when I go conduct, they don't care if I guest conducted here or there. It's irrelevant to them. They want to connect with it, with whatever I felt when I was 9. They want that.
I think that's wonderful. I get so much joy out of hearing this. I teach, like I mentioned, 11 and 12-year-olds, and they're kind of impressed if you can play Baby Shark, but they're not too impressed with your credentials, right? Like that's not how they think, and they don't care. They want to be engaged and connected and loved and supported, and that's what it's like to just look at life at nothing but possibility. And I think you're absolutely right that we confine ourselves to a very limited viewpoint of what's possible if we only look back and we don't look forward. And I think one of the things that we're looking, it's much more pressing as a national conversation is that how to widen the scope of being more inclusive and also having historical awareness and realizing that there were other composers than Beethoven at the time that history wasn't recognizing, or that there are composers right now and musical contributors that are still struggling to be recognized because they don't fit a certain sort of criteria of what's generally accepted. So I would only imagine that one of the elements to everything that you're doing is just finding the larger roles in regards to inclusivity and helping to widen our historical awareness of all these musical contributors. And that must be with programming or just with conversations and other things like that, because like you mentioned, you didn't know Gershwin until you heard Gershwin.
Yeah, it starts, I really believe that it starts at the age when we download into people's brains the systems. And, the old approach was, years ago, and it may still be ongoing in many circles, but if a kid brought to their teacher, said, "Oh my God, I just saw Hamilton. Can you teach me how to play Hamilton?" Or I just listened to, Taylor Swift's, new album. Can you teach me how to play that? The old thinking was, no, that's not good music. Beethoven's good music. You can play that on your own time. That's what the response would be. And that was how people said, when I would improvise, as I loved improvising, people would say, no, you can improvise on your own time. That's not important. Now, just think about the shift. If you say, oh, you love Hamilton? That's really amazing. Let's talk about Hamilton and why it works. And how about this? You can play Hamilton, but why don't you create a couple of variations on this song? Let's figure out the harmony in your song that you like. You like that one? Okay, let's figure out the harmony. Can you do that by ear? And then why don't you next week come with 2 variations on that theme? Who would approve of that is Beethoven, because that's what Beethoven did. He took the arias and the little, themes that were popular in Vienna, especially when he was younger, and he'd write sets of it. Look at the number of variations of the Works Without Opus. All those, Works Without Opus that nobody plays. Tons of sets of little variations in German dances and écossaise, and these were all popular tune style pieces, which Beethoven would dress up. Or he'd say, this was the popular aria because that opera had come into town, and I love that little bit of the opera. I'm going to take that and write 6 variations on it, and that's going to be my way of kind of showing my musical knowledge, my talent. Let's do the same thing, the same spirit of the same thing for today. And if you tell people that if they have just heard an incredible R&B song or an incredible work of musical theater or an incredible jazz album, and they've encountered that, they want to play it, you encourage them to play it and make something of their own in addition to that. That's a way of saying that the pantheon of who's the best, the system of Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, then Haydn, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, and going down, there's no place for Duke Ellington in that system. There's no place, honestly, for Gershwin or Copland. They're way at this bottom rung of saying, when you've figured out the masters, there are some Americans who are also good. We'll mention that. That's the European style. That's still how Europeans think of American music. It's like, yeah, once you figure out the really great composers, there's some Americans that we can throw in here and there. Why are we doing it that way? This is the country where those composers came from. And frankly, most of them all understood, Copland understood, that the music of the people were, cowboy songs, prairie tunes, folk songs. Ives understood that they were hymns and spirituals. And music that you would hear outside as 2 bands were marching in towards the town square. Gershwin understood that black music was America's true music, and if you could understand that energy and integrate it into your orchestral piece, anything was possible. Those were fundamental understandings. They are not so different than Mahler, including the sounds of his native Bohemia when he was growing up, and he heard the trumpet call off in the corner of the town square, or the military band came through. That he was doing the same thing that Ives was doing. Very different sound world, but same inspiration. Same as Beethoven, taking his inspiration from the popular aria of the day and making his own version of it. So let's connect with the spirit of it. And then you're going to get to inclusivity by default, because America's music and the music that we listen to is mostly generated from black composers, black artists. If you're honest about it, you can't help but be inclusive.
It's a wonderful mindset. And I think what's great about what you're saying is that, again, like we mentioned earlier, when our institutions lead through these ideas and by example, it inspires others to look within, because if you can do it, then of course we can do it as well. And I know we have to finish up here, because we've been very fortunate to speak with Teddy Abrams, who is incredibly busy with all the projects that he's doing. And I encourage you to just to find him either via his website, and all that information will be shared, and all the good work that he's doing and that you get to share and see on Facebook. But I think what we can all take away from this is that one of our slogans is to always be our best selves. And here is a shining example of someone being their best selves to use what they're passionate about, which is music and the arts, and integrate it with how we fundamentally can serve our community and bring the very best out of everybody around us. So I'd like to just thank you, Teddy, for being here today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is a wonderful program, and it's so great to reconnect after all these years, and so happy to share. Yeah, trying to be our best selves. That is a really great goal. That's an aspiration for all of us, for me too. I'll keep trying.
Oh, thank you very much. I just want to remind everyone that together we're better, and of course, always to be our best selves.